Hello everyone and welcome to this mini introduction into Element 3D, where I'll be showing you most of its features and how to use them. It might be over a decade-old plugin without too many updates in the last couple of years, but nonetheless a powerful tool which I still use to this day in every other project. This is mostly made for beginners, but I'm sure anyone could find a couple of good tips and tricks along the way. Let's get started. So I've got my Element 3D layer here, which is just a black solid with the effect on it and a black background. Let me just create a camera as well for later, just so we have it. And we'll go into the scene setup. Now, Element 3D is not made for 3D modeling. You do have the basic shapes here. For example, you can create a cube and then scale it up in XYZ here, adjust the segments. You even got the chamfer option here, but it's not made for advanced 3D modeling and so on. This feature is available in every 3D software, so I guess they've added as well. You can kind of use this to create, let's say, some sort of icon or maybe just a wall for your scene and so on. What you mainly want to do with Element is importing text, logos, or any kind of 3D model. So if we go into File here, under Import, we've got 3D Object and 3D Sequence. Now I do have a separate tutorial on the sequence part. If you want to import some 3D animated objects, you can do that as well. But you also got the big import button here if you just want to import some sort of model. Now let's say you've got this cool looking abstract from Sketchfab, but sadly it's only available in an FBX format or JLB. Element can only read OBJ, Element 3D files, and Cinema 4D. So once you've downloaded this model, you would need to convert it. So I am using Blender here, which is a free software, and it's something I recommend just having in case you want to convert files. So you basically import it into Blender, then you will go into Export and export it as an OBJ file under here. So once you've converted the model, you can go ahead and click on Import, find a location, select your model, and then Open. Let me hide the box here. And okay, this is great because sometimes the model is too small or too big for your scene. So what do? Obviously, you can go into the transform here and scale it up. And let me just drop a bright texture so we can actually see it. Okay, so we can scale it up here and you can see that we're going to 1000 and it's still rather small. So instead of doing this, you can just select normalize size and it will adjust the size of it to your scene. So this is just a basic feature you want to keep in mind when importing different objects into Element. Now you've got the basic transform settings here, auxiliary channels, which we'll get into in a bit, UV mapping, we'll get to all of these in just a bit. I do want to get into the groups here and tell you what are the different types of groups. So you can see that we have group folder here and it's set to group number 1. Let me go ahead and create a floor. So something I kind of get used to is using 3 hotkeys. So we've got R to bring up the scale properties, E for the rotation, and W for the transform. So let me go ahead and click R, make sure all 3 are highlighted, and I can just drag it here and scale up my floor. Now let's say I wanted to be a separate layer from my 3D model. So 2 things I can do. I can drag it out here, and then I can see it has its own number, set it to number 2, and hit OK. Now here we've got these 5 groups which we can control individually. So let's say we go into group number 2, I can drag my floor down, and then I can go into group number 1 and animate my object individually as well. We can also do a new group. So for example, we've got this folder icon, and we've got the group folder. I can set it to group number 2, import my floor, and then import, I don't know, different kinds of objects into this specific group and animate it individually. Now, just a couple of more things for the interface. What we have here is the presets, which you have your preset textures, which we'll get into. And you also got the model browser, which you have a starter pack, which Element comes with. And there are also a bunch of free packs available, such as these ones. And it's basically just models which you can just import with a click here, and you got it set up for animation with the textures already. So this is just a quick review of the basics in Element. Let's go over importing text and logos into Element. So I've got my basic 2D text here created in After Effects. I can modify this however I want to in terms of font, size, and so on. Then I go into Element here, and under custom layers, I've got something called custom text and mask, and I can simply select it under one of these layers here. So path number 1 will be my text. Let me go ahead and hide this layer, and we'll go into element. Now here I'll simply click on extrude, and I can see my text in 3D just like that. So what I can do here is some basic extrusion options. So we've got the extrude, which is basically how far it goes. We've got the edges, and I'm not going to get too in depth about these, but you can basically play around with these settings to create your sort of text with a bevel style and so on. Now let's say I want to import multiple text or a different layer. So I can duplicate this. Let me name this one text number 2. And I'll go into the path layer number 2 here and select my second text. Then I'll go into here, and I can either click on extrude again to create a new text layer, and I'll go here and select path number 2, and I can see it right here with my other path number 1. Now let's say I have this logo here and I want to make it 3D. So I'll do the same thing using mask. Now I'll go into layer, auto trace, select alpha since my layer is transparent, and hit on OK. Then we'll go into element, select it under path here, layer number 3. Then I can select extrude again. I'll select path number 3, and I've got a 3D extrusion of that model. Now, what if I want to maintain the texture from the 2D image onto this 3D image? So what we need to do here is pre-compose this layer, make sure it fits with the non-comp, move all attributes, and now we'll select layer, auto trace it again. I can disable the blur here and hit on OK. So we've basically done the same thing, but our composition size is the same as our main comp. So now if I go into element, I still have it set to layer 3 here. I can go into custom texture maps. So I'm selecting the same layer here and here. Let's go back into the scene setup, and under the texture of this model, I will click on diffuse, and I'll select my custom layer 1. Now this will look pretty weird like this, but a quick fix is clicking on use layer as UV, and now I've got my 2D image basically projecting onto this extrusion. Now let's say I want to add like a cool golden type of edge here. I can go into my extrusion model here. Under bevel copies, I will set it to 2. So now I have 2 copies of the same, and I can expand the edge here, extrude it down a bit, and move it in the Z offset. Then I'll go into my presets, physical, and let's say we want it to be golden. We'll drop this here, and now we've got this golden type of edge around our 3D logo, and we can start animating it. And if you go to your bevel presets here, you do have a lot of presets you can use, mostly for text, but I also use some of these for logos. But if we double click them, you can see we've got some interesting bevels here. And this works with flat logos or some text. If you need some texture on the logo, just like we did here, then we basically need to reset one of these layers and then import the image. Particle replicator and basic animation. So if you go into particle replicator here, we obviously got the basic transform settings, such as position, rotation, and we can animate them using keyframes. Now we've also got something called particle replicator. Now this is used to create some pretty cool motion graphics, usually with different models. So for example, if I set this to sphere, let me set the count to 20, and now I got 20 cubes in a spherical kind of shape. I can go into scale shape here and scale up the shape of the sphere. And I can also go into particle look here and bring down the size of my particle itself. So basically each one of these cubes is now a particle, and under these settings we control them individually. So for example, rotation random here, we can randomly rotate each of these particles, and we can also set a random size and so on. And there are also all kinds of shapes here, like a ring for example, and we can play around with these as well. Now we've also got scatter, which is basically to spread out the particles. This is good for creating just like if we set this to grid and we want to just scatter some pieces in 3D space, give them some random rotation just to fill in some depth, then we can do this. So that is your particle replicator. Now we've also got something under particle look, which is called multi-object. Now, this is what I usually use to animate particles or pre-fractured objects. And if we enable this, we can play around with the settings, but nothing really is going to happen. But for example, if we go into our scene setup here, in our starter pack, we've got something called floor fracture or ball fracture. Let's import that. I'm just going to scale it up a bit. So now if we go into the multi-object settings and select the random rotation, you can see that each one of these is rotating randomly based on these settings. So we can displace them, rotate them, and scatter and so on. So similar to before, we just have one 3D model with a bunch of small pieces, and we can randomly animate them using these settings. So again, similar to the particle look, we created a bunch of particles and we can animate them using these settings. Now, since this model includes a lot of models within one, we can animate it using the multi-object. Hopefully that kind of puts it into perspective and doesn't confuse you too much. We've also got a great feature that's called Deform, and it basically allows us to create all sorts of deformations of a model or text. So if we go into the particle look here, we've got something called Deform, and we can enable it. Then let's say we want to twist it, so we'll enable the twist, and we can twist it in the Y direction, but we do have some issues with the polygons being too low. So if I want this to be smoother, what I'm going to have to do is go back into Element, and since we are using a text here, I can switch to the wireframe view, and you can see that we don't have a lot of detail on our model. So to fix this, we'll go down into Surface Options, and we've got something called Subdivision Level. So we can bump this up to maybe 3, and this gives us a lot more detail to work with. And if we switch back to Shaded now, and go back here, try to twist it, you can see that we get a lot more detail and it's much smoother on the edges. So we can also use this for animations. For example, I've got this leather edges coming in spinning. So if I bring up the keyframes here, I can set a keyframe for my Y twist. And let's say we want to do about 90 degrees. Let's match the graph here with everything. So I'll just select them and match everything to be the same speed. And now we've got it coming in with like a twist, which adds to our animation, and we can utilize this in many other ways. There's also bending, which you can just bend the object in different directions, and there's also noise. Now, noise is great for creating some details like an ocean, or if you just want a plane to have some sort of detail. So for example, if we go ahead and create a plane here, let's hide our text here, and I'll just scale this up, switch back to my wireframe mode. So now, since we are using a plane, we can actually increase the segments here. So set this to be 50 by 50, and that gives us a lot more detail to work with. Let's switch back, hit OK. And let me show you what I mean. And let's enable the noise here. So if we give it a slight angle here and increase the noise, you can see that our shape is basically deformed. And we can animate this to be sort of like an ocean wave. So deforming can be great for animation as well as just giving something a bit more detail. Now let's go over some textures. So how do we use them? How do we import them? And so on. So if we go into the physical folder here, Element got a couple of presets we can use. So if I select Chrome, for example, let me double click it, you can see that our cube is now reflective and has this chrome type of finish. Now we do see some sort of an image inside, and that is our environment map. So if we go here and select this thing, it will usually take you to this folder, and these images come within your Element 3D, and it's basically what it's going to reflect. So let's select one of these, hit OK, and now we can see a different image within this texture. We can go down here, select how reflective we want it to be, and how glossy, and so on. So these are settings you play with when you animate your scene, and so on. Now, what if I want to import like a metal or brick type of texture onto this 3D model? So there's actually a great website called Polyheaven, where you've got this cool 3D textures. You've also got some models and environment maps, and this is all completely for free. Now, how do we import them? So let me go ahead and right click here and hit reset, and that resets our texture. And we can go ahead into the texture tab here and select diffuse, and we'll import the diffuse from the texture that we've got. So this is the texture I've got from Polyheaven, and I'm going to select the one that's called Diffuse. So this is our base color, and we have a display on this cube. Okay, so it does look pretty flat. We can see some reflections, but again, it is flat. So what we can do to enhance this, we can use the normal and bump map. Now, if you're completely new to 3D, this might sound kind of weird to you, but basically a normal map is something that looks like this usually. It's either called normal or bump, and it basically fakes the extrusion of a model. So if we go down to the side here, you can see it's kind of flat, but if we increase the bump, we can sort of see these edges. So this is something that I pretty much always use, especially in close-ups, to give the model some more details. Now there's obviously things like glossiness, reflectivity, and so on, and I won't get too much into it, but if we select illumination, for example, I've got this image here. Now usually a model where you have some glowing parts comes with one of these, but let's say we increase the contrast and up the brightness a bit. So I've just got this black and white grid here, and I'm gonna hit OK. Keep in mind I have it under my illumination tab. So if I go down here, I can change the color to something like green, and let's start increasing the intensity. So now we have this glowing green color driven by this illumination image. So again, this sometimes comes with the 3D model where you have some glowing pieces, but this is how you can control it using these settings. Now, just one more thing here is if we zoom in, you can see that the texture is not perfect, and that is because it's a simple cube without any UV data. So once I select my box here, we'll go down into UV mapping, and if we change this to box, for example, you can see it sort of aligns it to look a bit better. Again, it's not perfect because it's not UV mapped, but this is something I often use on flat surfaces, such as a floor or a box like this one, and I can even create duplicates. So I'll set this to 5 and 5, and now I got more of the texture displayed on this 3D model. So that's the basics of texturing in Element 3D. Aux channels are something very important for animating certain objects, and it becomes really useful once you understand how to use it. So you remember how we split the floor layer, for example, in a different group? So I set it under group number 2 here, and then we can animate the floor and the object individually later on. Now, what if we want to animate a certain part of the model, let's say this fan right here? So we can use auxiliary channels or aux channels to do so. For example, if we go into the texture here, we've got these two icons which basically switch from the material to the mesh view. So here you can see the individual pieces of this model. So for example, this last one here is our fan. Now, how do we animate it to spin without animating the whole group? So what we do here is we select this mesh, we right click it, go to auxiliary animation and select channel 1. Now we're gonna hit OK. And let me just move the camera here so we can see the fan. Now if we go into group 1, aux channels, channel 1, since it's the channel we set it to, we can animate this object individually. So if we go into the rotation, let's set a keyframe for the y-axis here. If you can see it, I will expand it here. So the Y rotation, let's set a keyframe here, go to 2 seconds long, and give it about 2 evolutions. So once we play this back, we have the fan individually spinning, and anything we set under channel 1 will basically follow these settings. So we can do this with multiple channels. For example, if we have a car, we can set each wheel to be under a different group if we want to, and then we can sort of animate them rotating in different directions. So auxiliary channels are something very useful when animating individual pieces of a bigger model. Alright, let's move on to the animation engine, which is probably the most powerful option within this tool. I use this all the time and it can create some really cool animations, and it's quite simple. So I've got my ball fracture here from the starter pack. Let me just scale it up a bit, and I will duplicate my group folder here, and I'll set it to number 2. Let's give it a different texture on my second group here, so I'll just give this a gold color, and this one will be black. Let's hit OK. I'm going to move group 1 here to the left. Then I'll go into particle look, multi-object, and make sure I enable it. Again, we went through this before. It basically animates each piece individually. And what I'm gonna do here is scroll down to Group Utilities, and I can copy and paste my Group 1 onto Group 2. So we'll go here and paste it. And what that does is basically paste the exact same settings from Group 1 onto Group 2. So if we go into Group 2 here, you can see that the multi-object is enabled since we copied it from Group 1. Let me just go ahead and move Group 2 to the right here. And we can now scroll down to Animation Engine and enable it. Let's go to the very first frame and set a keyframe from 0 to 100 on my animation. So what's going to happen is the first group is going to transition to the second group since it's the same 3D model with the exact same amount of pieces, but the texture is transitioning here midway. We can also go down into the directional options here and change the yaw here to 180. So we have it going in the right direction. So it goes from right here, transitions to right here, and this just fits our perspective a bit better. So we have two text layers, for example, and if we try to transition between 1 and 2, you can see that it's not as smooth as the previous animation because it is two completely different 3D models. So this works great when the model is exactly the same. You can use different textures, but only with the same 3D model. But you still can create cool text animations using this animation engine. The way I do this is if I take my first text layer, let me duplicate it into group number 2 here. So I just have two similar groups here. Let me go ahead and center it here. And again, I'm just going to copy and paste it into group 2. Let me disable the animation engine so I can actually see it. And I can animate this randomly. I can maybe animate the rotation as well. And just drag this back here, maybe below a bit, and so on. Now let's enable the animation engine. We'll change this to group 2 and group 1. And now we've got the text animated from one position to another. There's also something called animation type here. So for example, I've got this floor fracture. Let me drop the second model up top here, and I'll scramble the rotation here, maybe displace it like so. If we move here, you can see the second group. And let's enable the animation engine, start group 1, finish group 2. So it's basically animating from group 1 into group 2. And now it will go from the center because I have this set to radial. I can also reverse this by setting the radial option from outward to inward. So now it's going from the sides of this model onto the center. So again, a very powerful animation tool, and I use this quite a bit. So we do have something called utilities right here, and I don't really use this too often, but it's still a great tool if you want to position something in your 3D scene. So for example, I have my text here. Let me turn it into 3D. And let's say I want to place it on top of this box here to be in the correct position in 3D space. So let me just rotate it 90 degrees and I don't know, try to kind of position this. And now if we move around, it's not really on top. So it's giving me trouble and I want to put it right here. So this is where utilities come in handy. So what we can do is select a 2D point. Now anywhere we select on our 3D scene, it's going to basically create a 3D null. So if I click on top here and select generate null, we have a 3D null here with a position. So if we copy this position onto this text now, it basically placed it right on top of this box here. So you can see it's quite aligned in 3D space. So if you're trying to add some stock footage or anything to your 3D scene, this is a great way to find the right spot for it in your scene. Okay, now the most important part to have your scene look incredible is render settings. And I'm not talking about render quality or something like that, but here is basically where you control the shadows, light, and so on. So what do we have here? Physical environment is basically the environment map we've talked about previously. We can enable it in the background. So if you want to render some 360 or anything with the background behind it, you can enable that. And you got some basic color correction options right here and how it reacts to your scene. So I often use this to maybe rotate my environment. So usually I would hide it. then I would set a keyframe on one of the rotations here. So then instead of having a still frame, I've got this sort of like a image going around it and it's reflecting it. And you can obviously change this like I've shown you before, and it is a pretty useful tool. Next on, we got lighting. Now, this is not the lights from the comp. As you can see, you have an option to use comp lights or not, but this is rather a preset light where you can have some different colors and very cool variations, which you commonly see in different type of renders. And you can also control the rotation of it and the strength of it like so. Now, usually I do use this light and both the AE light. So I would create a new light. Element accepts all kinds of lights, but I usually work with parallel, spot, and very rarely with a point light where I just need to fill in some dark spots. So I'll choose the parallel light, let's keep the intensity 50 and cast shadows set to on. Now we'll hit position here and just move the light on top, bring it back a bit, and using this anchor point we can control where the light is going to. So let's say we just place it right here. And here you can enable and disable the light if you want to. So again, I do use both of these to create all sorts of interesting looks. And I do recommend playing around with the rotation settings here as well. Let's move on to the shadows, which is the most important part when selling your scene in certain shots, usually track shots and so on. So we'll go into the shadows here and enable it. Now, if we look back here, this is where our light is coming from. So it's going from there to behind. We can control it using this anchor point of our light and also move it in position to adjust our shadows as needed. We can also go into the light settings here to adjust the darkness. And under element shadow settings, we can either increase the shadow size in case we got bigger scenes or blur the radius if we need to soften up the shadows right here. So let's keep this on and move forward here. Subsurface scattering is something I don't really use with Element. It is basically the same effect you would get on your skin if light shines through this. I never really got to it, so I'm gonna skip this one for now. Now, ambient occlusion is similar to shadows, but I will say this is the most important setting to turn on because it basically enables shadows between objects. So I can increase the intensity here. And basically we get this contact shadow between different objects in our scene, and it obviously helps it look much more realistic and sell the shot. So these are one of the settings I always turn on no matter what I'm rendering. Even if it's just a text image, then we'll have a shadow between the letters and it's important to sell the shot. So again, very useful. Matte shadow and reflection we'll get into in just a bit. Fog is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically fog. So if you have a scene in the sky, for example, or even a dark scene like this one, let's enable the fog here. And I'll change the type to exponential. Let's increase the brightness. And now we can sort of cut our plane here using this black solid. We can change the color as needed. So again, if you're working in the sky or something, then you want to add a slight hue on your object so it matches the scene a bit better, and this is one of the options that will help you achieve this kind of look. So let's disable this for now and move on to motion blur. Pretty self-explanatory if we have some sort of animation. So let me just create 2 keyframes here. Obviously, to smooth things out, motion blur is always a good option. So let's go and enable it here. So once we play this back, we do have some motion blur with our camera movement and the scene as well. This is a setting I turn on usually after I'm finished with the scene, so just like a final touch. Depth of field is a great tool for creating close-ups. So usually what I would do is set this to focus indicator. Now if I go to my camera here, hit AA, let me just get a bit closer here and enable depth of field. Basically, whatever is highlighted in red is what's going to be in focus and the rest is going to be blurred out. So if we go back into element here, we'll set the mode to pixel blur. You can see that it's focusing only around this area, and we can control the amount of blur under our camera settings right here. So we've got the aperture and we've got the blur level. Depending on how close to the subject you are, you're going to adjust the settings. You can also keyframe them if the camera is moving. So this is the best option for creating realistic close-ups. Moving on to glow, we did talk about illumination maps before, where we created the glowing grid, and this model also has the light texture here, which is basically this text, and it sort of has this glow. Now, if we enable the glow under the render settings, we'll see only this area glow up, like I've mentioned before, because it has illumination channel data. So we can increase the intensity and play around with the glow settings. I will show you a technique I like to use instead of this glow setting, but this is also available if you need it. Now, ray tracer is something I don't think I ever used, but basically you can enable your shadows to be ray traced instead of shadow mapping. So for example, I'll set it to ray traced here. My ambient occlusion will also be set to ray traced. And this is great for, let's say, if you have a transparent object. So let me bring up a cube here. I'll scale it up here. And I'm just going to make it a transparent object. So I'll go into the texture settings here. And we've got something called force opacity. Let's set this to maybe 20 so we can sort of see through it. Now, we don't see any shadows within inside the box, we only see it around here, and we've also got the ambient occlusion. So where ray tracer comes in handy is if we set this to translucent, we are going to start receiving some shadows within transparent objects. So this is an option very specific if you want to sort of reveal something inside a bottle or something similar to that. So there it is. Again, I never really used it, but it's there if you need it. So camera cutoff is usually a problem solving thing where you don't really use it. I do have a tutorial using it to animate an object, but what it does is basically cuts off the plane far or near the camera. So what I mean is if we zoom out here enough, okay, right about here, you can see that there is a plane that starts to sort of cut away from our scene. So if we increase and decrease the far plane here, we can identify how far we want it to basically render. Now, the near plane is basically the same thing, but it's what's closer to the camera. So here I'm starting to get this cutting off. So I can increase this to something like 5, or rather decrease it, and that is going to fix my issue. Matte shadow or matte reflection is basically a way to only have an object display the shadows or the reflections on the scene. What I mean by that is if we go into the scene setup, and under our ground plane here, we can go into this reflect icon and set the mode to be a mirror surface. So basically it acts like a mirror and it's reflecting our text. And we can also set this to spherical if we got some ball here and you just wanted to reflect the environment around. But let's go with mirror surface for now. And I'll just show you this in the scene here. So it just acts as a reflection, following along nicely, and everything is great. We can also control the glossiness settings, as we mentioned before, how reflective and how glossy we want it to be. But matte shadows and reflections is basically if we scroll all the way down here, we've got these two options here. If we enable matte reflection, our floor plane will only display the reflection. And if we enable matte shadow as well, we'll see the shadows on it as well. Now, we don't see it in this interface, but once we hit on OK, you can see that we only see the shadow and the reflection on our scene. So usually on logos and text animations, if I just want a solid background, I would use a matte shadow, or even when you have a shot where you just want shadows enabled without the floor plane being visible. And finally, we've got output where we see each pass of our scene. So for example, we can change this to ambient occlusion and we can only see the ambient occlusion. We can do illumination and we'll only see the glowing parts and so on. And I commonly use it for compositing. So as we've mentioned before, we do have this glowing setting which we can enable and it will make the glowing parts glow. Now it's a great feature, but I do want to use deep glow for more realistic glow, for example. I can duplicate my element 3D layer, and on this layer I'm going to isolate the illumination tab, and now I've got my illumination in a separate 3D layer. So if I add a deep glow, for example, and this is a different plugin, but just as an example, I can add my glow here. Let me set to screen. And I basically got a layer only controlling the glow, and I can use a different type of glow or any type of effect. So another way you can use this is for depth of field. So if you don't want to mess with the camera depth of field, for example, let's duplicate the layer one more time. and I'll change the composite to Z depth. And now we can control the depth of our scene and basically define what's going to be in focus and what's going to be blurred out. So if I create a new adjustment layer, let's hide this and we'll add camera lens blur to this. And I'll set my blur layer to be the second element layer. Make sure I enable effects and mask. Then if I increase the blur here, so we can control the depth of field using this layer as well, instead of just using the camera. Another great feature is specular, for example. What I usually do is add a levels effect, and I basically isolate whatever is bright in our scene. Then I can add a glow to it, and I'll set the layer to screen, and then I have this nice looking glare on my glowing parts of my scene. So another great use for the outputs. Now, one more thing here, it is very important, is the multi-sampling and super sampling. This is commonly used when you experience a lot of flickering. I do have a short about this. So basically, if your scene has a lot of flickering due to reflections and so on, what you want to do is set your multi-sampling to 16, and the super sampling, I'll usually bump it to 2, sometimes to 4. Now, obviously, we do have the polygon mode here set to wireframe if you want to see the wireframe, and also point cloud. Just like a cool little pass you can render. Not sure if you can see this, but it is there if you want to. And finally, we do have this render mode, which is basically something you can make your scene run a bit smoother if you're just animating or just want to preview something and it gets heavy. You can change this to a draft or preview just so it lowers down the settings and you can get a faster preview. So we went over most of the features that Element 3D has to offer. Hopefully I did not forget any important details, but nonetheless, I hope you found this overview useful and can now get started on some exciting new projects. I do have some tutorials already available on the channel for specific effects, where I use most of the features we went over here, and I do plan on making more. I never made this kind of video before, so once again, I hope it was useful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorials.